It began with a question that was never meant to be answered. The post appeared late at night, quiet enough to be missed, ordinary enough to be ignored. There was no warning, no explanation, no context to anchor it in reality. Just a single question, typed into the endless stream of social media, floating briefly before being buried beneath newer noise. At first glance, it seemed harmless, almost trivial. But timing has a way of turning innocence into accusation. Within days, a young artist was dead. Official statements moved quickly. The language was efficient, sterile, reassuring. An accident related to alcohol. No foul play. No unresolved concerns. A tragedy, yes, but one already sealed, labeled, and archived. The system prefers clean endings. It always has. Yet the question remained. When people began to look back, to scroll upward through the digital timeline, something unsettling emerged. The words in that post no longer felt random. They echoed details that had not yet been made public. Details that, according to the official narrative, no one should have known at the time. Coincidence is a comforting word. It allows us to stop thinking. But coincidences become harder to accept when they start forming patterns. The post did not accuse anyone. It did not predict death. It did not even mention a name. And yet, for reasons no one could fully articulate, it felt out of place, like a door left open in a locked house. People began to ask questions in hushed tones, then louder ones. Screenshots circulated. Interpretations multiplied. What was once a single line of text transformed into a focal point of unease. We should pause here. This is not a story about superstition, nor is it an argument for fate. It is a record of how doubt is born. How a system designed to control narratives falters when fragments slip through its grasp. As news of the death spread, so did silence. The artist's final hours were summarized, not examined. Medical explanations were offered without elaboration. Timelines were compressed. Gaps were left unaddressed. And into those gaps, speculation flowed naturally, almost inevitably. Some turned to logic. Others turned to intuition. A few turned to places society often dismisses when answers are scarce. Tarot cards, spiritual readings, whispers of contracts and unseen costs. We do not need to believe these interpretations to understand their function. When transparency fails, people search elsewhere. What matters is not whether those readings were true. What matters is why so many felt compelled to seek them. Because this was never just about one death. As the days passed, more names surfaced. Older wounds reopened. Previous tragedies resurfaced with uncomfortable similarities. Delayed medical responses. Production schedules that never paused. Lives treated as replaceable components in a machine that could not afford to slow down. And suddenly, the post was no longer just a post. It became a signal, a crack, a reminder that not everything fits neatly into the explanations we are given. So before we go any further, we need to be clear about one thing. This is not an attempt to offer conclusions. It is an examination of contradictions. A journey through what was said, what was omitted, and what continues to linger in the spaces between. Because, once you notice the pattern, it is already too late to look away. The official story arrived quickly, as if speed itself could substitute for certainty. A statement. A cause. A closing line that implied there was nothing left to discuss. Alcohol. An accident. A private tragedy. The kind that demands sympathy, not scrutiny. In industries built on controlled images, This is how endings are manufactured. Clean enough to move on. Quiet enough to prevent questions from accumulating. But death does not always cooperate with public relations. What followed was not a single contradiction, but a cluster of small fractures. The kind that, by themselves, can be explained away. Delays happen. Miscommunications happen. People panic. Systems fail. In isolation, each detail can be dismissed. Together, they begin to feel less like error and more like a method. The first fracture was time. In most sudden medical emergencies, minutes matter. Yet in accounts circulating online, the timeline around the artist's collapse felt strangely compressed at the points where clarity should have existed, and strangely vague where precision should have been available. Who was present first when help was called? What immediate actions were taken? Whether any trained assistance was offered before transport? The story, as repeated, seemed to skip over the moments that often decide whether a person lives or dies. When a narrative is smooth, it usually means someone has been sanding down the edges. The second fracture was the question that appeared in the wake of a photograph. A final selfie posted from a hotel room should have been meaningless. A small proof of life, the sort of ordinary artifact people leave behind without knowing it will be their last. And yet viewers fixated on it, not because of the face in the frame, but because of what appeared unintentionally. A reflection caught in dark lenses. A hint of a room beyond the camera's intention. Nothing definitive. Nothing that could survive a courtroom standard of evidence. Still, it fed the same hunger that always emerges after an abrupt death. The need to see what the official story refuses to show. Soon after, a separate question surfaced online, framed as if it belonged to a medical forum rather than a scandal. If someone suffers nerve damage and numbness, how do they recover? On its own, it could have been a coincidence, a question asked by anyone, any day. But people noticed the timing. They noticed the proximity. They noticed how neatly it aligned with a growing rumor that the final hours were not merely chaotic, but cruel. This is the moment where modern grief becomes something else. It stops being private. It becomes investigative. Then came the third fracture, the toxin theory. Some internet users began to speculate about a neurotoxin, described in vague but alarming terms. A substance so potent that even a small amount could cause respiratory paralysis. In the most extreme versions of the rumor, it was framed as almost surgical, efficient, silent, leaving behind an outcome that could be explained as collapse, intoxication, or natural failure. We need to say this plainly. There is no verified public evidence that such a substance was involved. Not in official statements. Not in confirmed medical records. Not in anything that can be independently audited. But rumors do not spread only because they are true. They spread because they fit the emotional geometry of the situation. They spread because people feel they are being asked to accept an ending without being allowed to see the full script. And that is where this story connects to something larger. The artist's death did not occur in a vacuum. It landed in a year saturated with loss and scandal, where the entertainment world appeared, from the outside, to be shedding its dead weight in real time. Deaths attributed to illness. Careers collapsing under allegations. Public disputes over unpaid wages. Directors and performers, people who once seemed untouchable, reduced to pleading for money online like day laborers denied their pay. The surface narrative was chaos. The deeper suggestion was structure. In the weeks after the death, comparisons began to circulate. Another young performer from years earlier. Another incident followed by public outrage and institutional quiet. According to allegations repeated online, That earlier case included a routine medical check, normal vital signs, and then a sudden deterioration after a meal provided by a production team. The most disturbing claim was not about poison or conspiracy. It was about indifference. About the idea that a human collapse was treated like an inconvenience, a delay in the schedule, an obstacle to be managed rather than a life to be saved. If this pattern is real, then the most frightening part is not the method of death. It is the system's ability to make death feel ordinary. So we return to the questions that people keep asking, not because they enjoy darkness, but because they cannot accept an ending that feels manufactured. Why did the timeline blur at the crucial moments? Why did so many details remain unaddressed? Why did a question about nerve damage appear when it did? And why, in an industry that claims to worship fame, do so many lives seem to end in the same silence? Why would someone ask about nerve damage at that exact moment? When official explanations end, alternatives rush in to fill the vacuum. This is not because people are irrational, nor because they crave fantasy. It is because silence creates a space where meaning must be found somewhere, anywhere. In the absence of verifiable answers, belief becomes a coping mechanism, and interpretation becomes a form of resistance. As public statements grew shorter and media coverage softened into repetition, attention shifted elsewhere. Not toward new evidence, but toward older instincts. Tarot readers, spiritual intermediaries, individuals who claim to listen where institutions refuse to speak. Their influence did not emerge overnight. It surfaced gradually, almost reluctantly, as if even those seeking them were aware of how fragile such explanations could be. Yet they listened anyway. One reading in particular spread faster than the rest. It was recorded, clipped, reposted, and translated across platforms. The medium did not present themselves as a prophet, nor did they claim certainty. They began the session cautiously, describing sensations rather than conclusions. Resistance, interference, a pressure that felt external rather than emotional. Then the reading stopped. According to the recording, the medium claimed they were interrupted by what they described as guidance from elsewhere, urging them not to continue. The message, vague but unsettling, suggested that the individual they attempted to read was surrounded by something hostile, something that did not want to be named. In another context, this would have been dismissed immediately. Here, it found an audience. The language used was not new. Spiritual contracts, binding agreements, prices paid in advance for success that arrives faster than it should. These ideas exist in every culture, resurfacing whenever ambition and mortality collide. What made this moment different was not the symbolism itself, but its timing. The reading arrived when trust in official narratives was already eroded, when audiences were primed to believe that the truth, whatever it was, lived somewhere off record. From there, speculation escalated. Some viewers focused on patterns of behavior rather than metaphysics. Repeated gestures during live broadcasts. Objects arranged with unusual precision. Movements that seemed ritualistic only after they were framed that way. Once the idea was planted, everything became potential evidence. A stone placed on a table. A pause before speaking. A glance away from the camera held too long. This is how meaning multiplies under pressure. It is important to be precise here. None of these observations prove the existence of rituals, contracts, or unseen entities. They do, however, reveal something equally important. They show how quickly a community will construct its own explanatory system when it believes the official one has failed. What followed was a shift from symbols to stakes. The readings did not stop at interpretation. They began to issue warnings. Names were mentioned indirectly, sometimes through initials, sometimes through descriptions that made identification inevitable. One figure, young and visibly successful, was framed not as a beneficiary of these forces, but as their potential victim. According to the narrative that formed online, power does not always protect. Sometimes it marks. The suggestion was not that success required corruption, but that survival within the system did. That refusing to participate in certain arrangements could make a person more vulnerable than agreeing to them. In this version of events, death was not punishment for excess, but a consequence of non-compliance. Again, there is no way to verify such claims. But they resonated. Another name surfaced, connected to the final hours of the deceased. A person who had been present, who had acted quickly enough to be noticed, and then disappeared from public view. Online, absence became suspicious. Rumors followed predictable paths. A sudden relocation. A retreat into obscurity. Tarot interpretations suggested betrayal realized too late, silenced by someone higher in the hierarchy. The narrative grew darker, but also more coherent. This was no longer about ghosts or demons. It was about power structures that feel supernatural because they are inaccessible. Decisions made behind doors that never open. Consequences enforced without signatures. Systems that operate with the efficiency of ritual, repeating the same outcomes while denying the same responsibilities. In this context, spiritual language functions as metaphor as much as belief. A contract becomes a career obligation no one dares to describe openly. A curse becomes reputational erasure. A sacrifice becomes a life lost to protect something larger, quieter, and far more profitable. And yet the emotional effect is the same. Fear spreads. Vigilance increases. Every silence feels deliberate. Every delay feels ominous. People begin to ask not who is guilty, but who is next. This is the atmosphere in which these stories thrive. Not because they are comforting, but because they mirror reality too closely to ignore. An industry that rewards obedience, punishes refusal, and erases those who disrupt its rhythm does not need supernatural enforcement. It already operates beyond accountability. So when viewers watched those readings, when they shared clips and debated meanings, they were not surrendering to superstition. They were articulating a truth they felt, but could not document. That something was wrong. That the system was hostile to transparency. That protection came at a cost rarely disclosed. And that cost, whatever its nature, was not always paid by those at the top. In a world where silence is currency and survival depends on compliance, the most dangerous position may not be power itself, but proximity to it without protection. In a system that feeds on silence, who gets chosen next? If the earlier questions circled around how someone died, this part confronts why such deaths can happen at all. To understand that, we have to stop looking at individuals and start examining the structure that surrounds them. Because what sustains an industry is not talent, nor vision, nor even profit alone. It is compliance. And compliance, when demanded at scale, requires leverage. In recent years, that leverage has become increasingly visible. Actors once shielded by fame began appearing online to do something unthinkable only a decade earlier. They begged for wages they had already earned. Not quietly, not through private negotiations, but publicly, with recorded statements and exhausted expressions. They named projects. They named delays measured not in days, but in months. The justifications offered by producers followed a familiar script. The platforms had not released funds yet. There were accounting errors. The paperwork was incomplete. Then, when the platforms confirmed payment had been made, The excuses changed. Some producers responded with indifference, bordering on cruelty. They told performers to wait, to be patient, to be grateful for the opportunity. In at least one recorded exchange, the logic inverted completely. The debtor behaved like a benefactor, while the person owed money was expected to plead like a servant. This was not an isolated case. Directors, too, were drawn into the same cycle. One filmmaker described the process of recovering payment not only for themselves, but for their entire crew. Lighting technicians, camera operators, assistants whose names never appear in headlines. The effort required was relentless. Endless documentation, repeated submissions. Bureaucratic exhaustion designed not to resolve the issue, but to outlast the person demanding fairness. This is how exploitation hides in plain sight. Not through violence, but through attrition. As liquidity dried up across the industry, desperation became normalized. What had once been an exception turned into an annual ritual. Another scandal. Another unpaid project. Another round of public humiliation masquerading as transparency. The narrative shifted subtly. Financial collapse was framed as misfortune rather than misconduct. Everyone was struggling. Everyone was a victim. Except some people never stopped being paid. Behind these visible disputes, a darker layer persisted, rarely acknowledged without anonymity. Allegations of sexual coercion. Meetings held in private offices far from sets and studios. Invitations framed as opportunities. Promises of access, of roles, of protection. When declined, those offers did not simply vanish. They transformed into pressure. One story, circulated widely but without names, described a veteran director. A figure whose career spanned decades, whose awards filled shelves, whose influence extended far beyond a single company. According to the account, he targeted a student, young and ambitious, still close enough to believe that talent alone could open doors. An intermediary delivered the message plainly. The director was interested, not professionally. When refusal came, persistence followed. The student was summoned to an office in a district known for housing production companies. The setting itself carried a warning. Restricted areas. Rooms not meant for meetings. Conversations that drifted from opportunity into negotiation. The director spoke at length, offering nothing concrete, testing boundaries rather than committing resources. It became clear that the transaction he envisioned did not involve contracts or scripts. What saved her was clarity. She asked questions. She demanded specifics. She recognized the pattern. When it became obvious that the promises were hollow, the meeting ended. There was no dramatic confrontation. No threats. Just a door closing on a future that had been dangled but never intended to materialize. Others, however, may not have had the same leverage. In this environment, silence is not passive. It is enforced. Careers stall without explanation. Projects disappear. Names fade from casting lists. And when someone collapses, when a life ends abruptly, the system responds not with investigation, but with efficiency. The schedule adjusts. The role is recast. The narrative is simplified. This is where the earlier questions return with greater weight. If someone refuses to participate in informal arrangements, what protections do they lose? If an artist becomes inconvenient rather than profitable, how quickly does concern evaporate? And if a death can be explained away as misfortune, how much incentive exists to examine it further? The most disturbing possibility is not that the industry kills its own. It is that it does not need to. It only needs to create conditions where exhaustion, neglect, and disposability do the work quietly. Where accountability is so diffuse that responsibility dissolves. Where power operates through implication rather than command. In such a system, tragedy does not feel like a failure. It feels like maintenance. So when people suggest that certain deaths occurred because someone refused a deal, they are not necessarily invoking conspiracy. They are articulating a reality where refusal carries consequences even if no one explicitly threatens them. The punishment is structural. The harm indirect. The outcome predictable. This does not require malice from every participant, only indifference from enough of them. And that is why these stories persist, why they connect disparate scandals into a single narrative, why audiences no longer accept isolated explanations. Because once the machine is visible, every incident feels less like chance and more like function. In an industry built on obedience, refusal is the most dangerous act of all. By the time we reach the end of this story, the original question no longer stands alone. It has been joined by others, quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to dismiss. What began as a single post, a fleeting line of text, has unfolded into a landscape shaped by absence. Missing explanations. Missing accountability. Missing lives. The death of one young artist forced a pause, but only briefly. The system adjusted as it always does. Schedules shifted. Roles were reassigned. Statements were issued with practiced restraint. On the surface, order was restored. But beneath that surface, something else continued to move. Patterns rarely announce themselves all at once. They emerge gradually through repetition. A delayed response here. An ignored collapse there. A familiar excuse recycled until it loses meaning. When viewed individually, these incidents can be rationalized. When viewed together, they suggest design rather than disorder. This is not an accusation disguised as a conclusion. It is an observation supported by accumulation. Throughout this story, we have avoided declaring absolute truths. We have not named perpetrators with certainty, nor have we claimed knowledge that cannot be verified. That restraint matters. It is the difference between investigation and rumor. But restraint does not require blindness. It requires attention. The entertainment industry, like any structure built on power imbalance, depends on silence to function efficiently. Silence from those who benefit. Silence from those who fear replacement. Silence from those who are told that speaking out will cost them everything they have worked for. Over time, that silence becomes normalized. It is reframed as professionalism, as discretion, as survival. And then, when something goes wrong, silence becomes the explanation itself. What lingers after this case is not certainty, but responsibility. Not the responsibility of any single individual, but of a system that repeatedly asks its most vulnerable participants to absorb the consequences of its excesses. When an artist collapses, when a life ends abruptly, the question should never be how quickly we can move on. It should be how easily we allowed conditions where this outcome was possible. Some have turned to metaphysics to express this discomfort. They speak of contracts and curses, of forces that demand payment. Whether one believes in such frameworks is beside the point. These narratives endure because they describe something real in symbolic terms. They give language to exploitation that is otherwise invisible. They translate power into something people can feel. Others cling to a quieter hope. The belief that memory itself is a form of resistance. That refusing to forget, refusing to accept convenient explanations, creates pressure over time. Not enough to topple giants overnight, but enough to crack the foundation they stand on. This is where the audience enters the story. Every question asked publicly disrupts the rhythm of erasure. Every detail preserved prevents closure from becoming concealment. Every refusal to let a name fade undermines the system's most effective defense: time. You do not need to believe in hidden rituals or unseen forces to understand this. You only need to recognize how often truth is delayed, diluted, and eventually buried beneath distraction, and how rarely it stays there forever. For those who continue to watch, to share, to ask uncomfortable questions, the act itself matters. Not because it guarantees justice, but because it denies indifference. It affirms that a life cannot be reduced to a footnote, no matter how efficient the narrative that follows. The system is still standing. But now it knows we are watching.